You developed the Spartans to crush human rebellion, not to fight the Covenant.
When one human world after another fell, when my Spartans were all that stood between humanity and extinction, nobody was concerned about why they were originally built.
When talking about the Spartans, thoughts quite naturally turn to the origins of the program. And it doesn't take very long to establish a timeline that highlights an uncomfortable truth. The Spartan program was initiated in 2511, then known as Generation 2 of the Orion Project. The children who were abducted, conscripted, and indoctrinated into the UNSC as candidates and trainees of the Spartan program were just 6 years of age in 2517, and humanity didn't have first contact with the Covenant, or indeed know of any evidence of their existence, until 2525. Which means Spartans were created to fight other humans, which, when you compare and contrast the sheer power and speed of a Spartan against a normal human, you realize the unbelievable power gap would see any human facing a Spartan being laughably outmatched, outclassed, and outmaneuvered. Why was it necessary to make super soldiers so unbelievably powerful just to take on a ragtag band of rebels using out-of-date weapons? Today, we discuss the specifics of the Carver Findings and the events that took place on the build-up to the Insurrection to get a full understanding of the dynamics at play and if the Spartans were really warranted or not. The Carver Findings refer to a set of controversial predictive analyses conducted by Dr. Elias Carver, a human political scientist and data analyst within the Halo universe. His research focused on analysing complex socio-political trends within the Unified Earth Government, or UEG, and its colonies, ultimately predicting large-scale instability and conflict. Dr. Carver's work in the late 25th century outlined several dire conclusions about humanity's future. His primary findings suggested that the insurrection was inevitable. Carver's model indicated that unless drastic measures were taken, the outer colonies would inevitably rebel against the UEG due to economic exploitation, political neglect, and cultural divisions. His analysis showed that local skirmishes and dissatisfaction would evolve into full-scale insurrection, with the potential for prolonged war between the inner and outer colonies. If left unchecked, Carver believed humanity would fracture entirely, leading to the collapse of the UEG and possible regression into multiple warring factions. When presented to the UEG and the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, Carver's findings were met with a mix of concern and skepticism. ONI, always pragmatic, took his predictions seriously and began planning covert operations to mitigate the worst-case scenarios. In response to the Carver findings, Dr. Catherine Halsey expanded on Carver's conclusions with her own research, which aligned with his predictions, but on a much accelerated timescale. She proposed the development of genetically augmented super soldiers to suppress insurrectionists in the outer colonies. The immediate consequences of these findings were the UEG ramping up military presence in the outer colonies, particularly at locations known to have previously experienced problems with rebellion. Despite the strategic actions taken based on his work, Carver's findings faced criticism from political leaders. Many within the UEG believed his models were overly deterministic and failed to account for diplomatic solutions or economic reforms that could prevent violence. While this is true that potentially economic reforms and diplomatic solutions could and should have been explored, it was in the UEG's opinion that the outcry in the outer colonies were as a direct consequence of fear of the actions of the rebels themselves, more than an actual desire for independence. And this opinion stemmed back to the understanding of the specifics of the colonization efforts. So, let's go back a little further. Following the interplanetary wars, humanity had experienced an unprecedented period of peace, prosperity, and expansion. The Domus Diaspora that had truly begun in 2362 and was driven by the recent innovation of the Shore Fujikawa translite engine and the ability to traverse interstellar distances in weeks, ushered in a period of over a century of peaceful expansion into the stars. By the end of this period, 800 worlds had been colonized by humanity, and immense innovations in technologies that aided this endeavour reigned supreme, with wartime and military innovations majoritively stagnating. However, despite the prosperity and advancement in living conditions, healthcare, lifespan, and much more experienced by all, by 2475, a number of civilian uprisings occurred throughout human-occupied space and continued for the next decade. In spite of massively increasing living conditions and utterly phenomenal advancements in technology during the Domus Diaspora, certain groups were still not happy. The original motivations of these groups may have been a desire for self-autonomy on the far-flung outer colonies, but the specifics are not known. During the very early days of expansion, only very vigorously tested and selected candidates were chosen to settle the early colonies, which eventually came to be known as the inner colonies. After many of these had been settled, the criteria for selection was relaxed and more or less anybody was able to settle new colonies. The more distant and more recently founded colonies came to be called the outer colonies. In both cases, the UEG and the CMA both funded, supplied, and administrated the colonization efforts. The ships that were commissioned, the crew to staff them, the resources that were supplied, even the ships themselves were often landed and dismantled and used to be the foundational basis of most of the colony's early settlements, including reusing the reactors to power the colonies. In every case, the UEG and CMA footed the bill for colonial settlement, likely to the tune of billions, if not trillions of credits per colony. The implementation of trading agreements and taxes to recoup this immense cost and share the growing wealth and prosperity of the human sphere across all colonies is a relatively reasonable thing to expect to happen. Yet within a generation or two of these settled colonies, small groups wanted independence and were willing to use violence if necessary in order to achieve it. These acts of violence that began in 2475 and continued for over a decade were suggested to have even been as severe as using nuclear devices and dirty bombs on civilian populations. In Mortal Dictator from the Kilo 5 trilogy, as Seren Osman, protege of Synconi Admiral Margaret Parangosky, pored over the reports on the Far Isle Rebellion that resulted in the UEG using nukes and levelling the colony, she came across reports that confirmed that the early rebellion had done just as bad, if not worse, against civilian populations as the Far Isle Rebellion, which is often regarded as one of the most heinous acts the UEG ever perpetrated. Given this information, it would have been clear to the UEG that these small groups were nothing more than terrorist cells that wanted to sow the seeds of rebellion, violence, and hatred across the colonies and were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to do so. As is the case with so many governments, there was absolutely no intention to negotiate with terrorists, and the threat they posed was more than likely the motivating factor behind the growing rhetoric from the outer colonies that independence was all that was wanted, if nothing else just to give them what they wanted so the violence could come to an end. But the UEG were never going to submit to those terms. The UEG and the CMA's response was unapologetically swift and severe, which ultimately only led to increased tensions and resistance, leading many citizens of the outer and inner colonies to question the draconian tactics used by the UEG to keep the colonies in line, ignorant of the violence perpetrated by the rebels themselves. In 2492, the UNSC arrived at Far Isle, a colony established on an ocean world in the Capstone system in 2421. Due to ongoing tensions between the UEG and the rapidly proliferating rebel groups, a civilian revolt broke out on the colony. This, similarly to many circumstances such as this, likely started with organised civil protests being hijacked by more extreme groups who used the crowds and the anonymity afforded by it to escalate to violence. Then, helped in no small part by the riot psychology of de-individuation, emotional contagion, and social identity theory, whereby normal people in abnormal psychological and social conditions, such as anonymity, shared emotion, and heightened identity, override individual restraint, and the violence and the revolt rapidly spread. Add to this guerrilla tactics and being embedded and indistinguishable from the native population, whom were likely rioting or merely onlookers to the chaos that had befallen their home, the UNSC had no means to contain the rebellion through conventional tactics. Then they did the unthinkable and resorted to using nuclear weapons to raze the entire colony. One would like to believe that whatever was happening groundside was so severe, so utterly uncontrollable, that use of such force was proportional. But it's difficult to picture how such a circumstance would ever come to pass, and why utilization of nuclear arsenals was the conclusion that the UNSC ultimately came to. Just 2 years following this, in 2494, rebel forces were suspected of diverting selenium and technetium, materials utilized heavily in the production of the Shaw Fujikawa translate engines. Although there was seemingly selenium and technetium appearing in the black market, generating immense profits, the UEG also acknowledged that it was possible that the rebels were acquiring slip-space engine components. Given the rebels had already incited violence across dozens of outer colony worlds, and seemingly used nuclear devices and or dirty bombs on civilian populations, the suggestion that they were acquiring slip-space engine components pointed to the very real possibility that they were escalating the force of their attacks. Using a slip-space engine to destructive ends could be cataclysmic beyond the use of nuclear weapons. Setting off an unmounted and uncontained slip-space engine within a city, for example, would literally translocate a huge portion of the city to the 11 hyperdimensions of slipstream space, rendering it all as a rapidly dissipating field of subatomic particles within the abyss. What would follow was the Callisto incident, where the UNSC corvette the Callisto was patrolling the 26 Draconis system, stopping vessels for routine inspection, was searching a merchant vessel for slipspace components when either one or several of the nervous crew drew weapons and shots were exchanged, leading to the deaths of 3 UNSC naval officers and 27 merchant crewmen. 37 days following this, the Callisto was ordered to search a similar vessel when it was boarded by local terrorists, immediately following venting their cargo bay and ejecting several UNSC officers into space. They gutted and replaced the ship's computer systems and began using the military vessel against UNSC forces in the area. The UNSC responded aggressively and sent a battle group of 3 destroyers. The engagement was brief but pivotal. The 3 destroyers located the Callisto, which turned and began to flee towards an asteroid field. Upon closing with the ship and firing their Ares missile, the Callisto rolled and executed a slingshot maneuver. While it was behind the asteroid, a nuclear device detonated on its forward face, sending debris directly at the battle group, wiping out the missiles, obliterating the forwardmost ship, the Buenos Aires, damaged the Jericho, and a glancing blow to the Las Vegas. The Callisto re-emerged and engaged the remaining ships, disabling them both. The Las Vegas announced an unconditional surrender and asked for aid for the wounded. The rebels on the Callisto agreed to dock and assess the wounded and evacuate them to the Lawrence space station. The surrender was a ruse. When the Callisto docked, the crew of the Las Vegas fired an Ares missile into the Callisto while it was docked, crippling the ship and forcing their surrender. The Las Vegas had in this moment faked a distress call to use as a tactical advantage, a massive breach of common space law. Just 13 years later, in 2507, the young doctoral candidate Catherine Halsey reviewed and refined Carver's models, stating that while he was correct in his general assessment, his projections didn't fully factor in humanity's technological advancements and the potential for strategic intervention. Humanity were headed for civil war, and it was coming within the next 20 years. ONI renewed their interest in the Carver findings and Halsey's amended calculations. many within the administration agreeing with Halsey's assessment, and efforts were made to acquire her for covert operations within ONI's Section 3. In 2510, Halsey joined ONI with the Spartan program being initiated the following year, in 2511. In August of the same year, a terrorist suicide bomber loaded a mining-grade nuclear explosive and several thousand pounds of scrap cadmium into a rental truck and detonated it in Haven on Mamor. The explosion killed an estimated 2 million and injured a further 8.3 million, devastated 500,000 hectares of farmland, and ejected radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. Attacks and retaliations between the insurrectionists and the UNSC continued at this cadence for many, many years, up to and after humanity's first encounter with the Covenant, because many insurrectionists believed the Covenant was a lie made up by the UNSC to try to bring an end to the hostilities. The UNSC counter-operations included Operations Veritas, Charlemagne, Kaleidoscope, Tanglewood, and dozens of others, seemingly all in retaliation to attacks perpetrated by the insurrection. So with all this in mind, the wider rhetoric that the UNSC and the UEG were employing aggressive military tactics against political dissenters doesn't seem entirely accurate. Of course, there was room for peaceful and diplomatic resolutions. There should have been a dialogue and political conversations being had between the UEG and those who wanted independence, and yes, there might well have been a happy medium that all sides could have agreed to. But this is ignoring the fact that many within the early rebellion had no interest in negotiation, freedom, or liberation. They simply wanted to viciously murder those with whom they disagreed. The UEG funded and supplied the establishment of all 800 human colonies to an almost incalculable cost. Wanting to recoup those costs through trades and taxes is not an unreasonable request given the investment. If the colonists who wanted independence had financed, built, supplied, and settled the colonies on their own dime, it is of course a completely different situation. But they didn't. And those who wanted violence above all else cannot be classified as political dissenters, nor a ragtag band of rebels with out-of-date weapons. The insurrectionists weren't just political separatists. They engaged in coordinated terrorist attacks, rioting, sabotage, assassination, use of nuclear weapons, and dirty bombs in civilian areas, targeted strikes on infrastructure, UNSC ships, and personnel, and civil uprisings on multiple colonial worlds. This escalates them from dissenters or rebels into non-state militant actors employing asymmetric warfare and weapons of mass destruction. If this happened on Earth today, what would be the response? The international response would begin to mirror the UNSC in tone. Drones, special forces, surveillance state creep, and preemptive strikes, possibly AI-driven targeting, suppression tech, mass detainment. But it would be carried out by the member nations, not by a single global body like the UNSC. Nevertheless, the response would be similar. But against such a foe, where they can hide amongst civilian populations but have zero regard for them, where they knowingly and willingly use weapons of mass destruction against their attackers and innocents alike, and where basically any major military retaliation seemingly encourages more people to join their cause, the conventional military tactics were no longer serving their purpose, and were only causing further bloodshed. And the escalation was heading in one direction and one direction only: the full collapse of human society, an existential threat to humanity perpetrated by humanity themselves. And when a species is dealing with an existential crisis, all of the normal rules of engagement and morality can and often are suspended. And in the UNSC's case, the result of this was the Spartans, child soldiers, kidnapped at the age of 6, replaced with flash clones who perished shortly thereafter. Training and indoctrinating these children training them to be the most lethal soldiers humanity have ever seen, then putting them through horrific physical and biological augmentations that would kill nearly half of them, but the half that remained, once given the most advanced piece of military technology humanity had ever created, would be 7-foot tall, half-a-ton super soldiers who could punch through concrete, react almost instantly to events playing out on the battlefield, lift quite literally dozens of tons, and be basically invincible to all small arms fire and nigh on unkillable. And they would be used to crush the human rebellion precisely, efficiently, surgically. But was the use of Spartans, utterly colossal, near godlike superhuman soldiers, necessary to employ against a group of what many would call political dissidents? Well, these were political dissidents who were not above using nuclear devices on civilian populations. Yes, making child soldiers is horrific, no doubt, but the Carver findings, augmented by Halsey's 16-dimensional algorithms, were clear. It identified that human rebellion of the outer colonies was inevitable, and that at best it would be billions dead, and at worst would utterly destroy human civilization, annihilation of most of our population, and forcing the survivors back to the Stone Age. The UEG's policy was not to negotiate with terrorists, which is what the rebels were at this point. Although there were groups that centered around a more political rally, there were still groups who wanted independence and were willing to use violence to achieve it, and before long, rapidly escalated to using dirty bombs to wipe out civilian population centers. Although the wider rhetoric in the outer colonies was that many wanted independence, the loudest voices shouting that were the same voices bombing civilians, leading the UEG to believe most were calling for independence out of fear of the rebels, which may or may not have been entirely true. In either case, the decision was clear. The rebellion needed quelling quickly and efficiently to avoid the collapse of human society. Previous efforts with full-scale military mobilization had resulted in extreme collateral damage, up to and including the use of nuclear devices on entrenched rebel forces within populated cities. This was not an option to quell what the UEG saw as a mortal threat to humanity. So, something more precise was needed, something more surgical, rather than the blunt instrument of the UNSC. The Far Isle Rebellion is a prime example of the UNSC's blunt force approach, where a brief but uncontained rebellion broke out on a colony and the UNSC resorted to the use of nuclear weapons to raise the colony. Colonel Robert Watt's capture during Operation Talon is an example of the Spartans approach, where a small 5-man team of Spartans infiltrated a rebel base, located the de facto leader of the insurrection, an ex-UNSC officer no less, and extracted him, alive, from the base, effectively cutting off the head of the rebellion in the system and gaining invaluable intel on the sectionist Union, United Rebel Front, and the insurrection at large, with only the loss of 5 personal guards and a few dozen United Rebel Front dock workers. So off of some of the successes of earlier super soldier programs, the Spartans were created, and they were meant to surgically cut out the rebellion and insurrectionist forces with minimal collateral damage. The fact that immediately following the Spartans' first mission, the Covenant arrived, doesn't change the fact that the rebellion was a very, very real threat to all of human civilization, and many would argue that when you're dealing with the near annihilation of a species, the ethical concerns surrounding the nature of the Spartan program are very much a secondary consideration. It doesn't change the horrific nature of the programs, but in both cases, we are dealing with the survival of our species. Complete societal collapse with the rebels, or the extinction of us and all other species in the galaxy with the Covenant, had they used the rings. In both cases, where extinction is a very real possibility, any alternative is for the better, no matter what that means. The UNSC and the UEG provided all of the technology for spaceships, faster-than-light travel, nuclear fusion power plants, space tethers. Most of the human economy, in fact, relied and was dependent upon the UEG and the UNSC. They ran the logistics of moving essential resources between colonies. They acquired multiplanetary organizations to aid with freight and shipping. They supplied all of the original technology and equipment suitable for colonization efforts, and the UNSC represented the singular government, the UEG, that made all of that possible in the first place. It should be expected then for the UEG to have it in mind to recoup the costs through trade and taxes, yet after only a few decades, groups wanted full independence, despite not playing a hand in much of the heavy lifting of establishing the colonies in the first place. If a full-blown war broke out between the UNSC and the insurrectionists, billions would die. Not only from the war itself, but from all of the plights of a failing economy. Poverty, exposure, lack of sufficient healthcare, famines, droughts, lawlessness, rioting, random acts of violence, mass murder, and more, including the insurrectionists and the UNSC likely using weapons of mass destruction against civilian populations, and the UNSC fielding retaliatory strikes that, while proportional, have equal devastation and collateral damage. This threat rivals the Cold War in its significance, but on an interstellar scale. And after the war finally abated, likely through attrition, the surviving human populations would be disparate, with no technological support, no ability to get essential resources from other planets, likely no space travel, likely no nuclear fusion power plants, meaning no power, inevitably leading to the deaths of billions more. If that cannot be considered a societal collapse and an existential threat to a species, I don't know what is. While Carver's findings were initially intended to predict human conflict, their influence extended beyond insurgency preparation. Though Carver never foresaw the Covenant's arrival, the preparation inspired by his findings, such as the Spartan program and increased fleet presence in the outer colonies, ultimately helped humanity survive the early Covenant onslaught. It begs the question, if the full toll is most of humanity dying and the remnants of civilization are thrust back to the Stone Age, is maintaining the UNSC and the UEG's prosperous life across the colonies worth the trade-off? Is the lives of the many worth more than the lives of the few? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, kindly tap that like button, and if you're not already subscribed and want to see more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. Pop a comment down below telling me what you thought of today's video, or if you want me to cover something specific in the near future. I want to take this opportunity to thank and give shoutouts to my patrons and YouTube supporters: Spartan-10148, my singular contender class ancilla, the triumvirate of minds within my installation's Metarch, Falcon, Jordan, and Poseidon, my 7 installation monitors, Selphia, Ashley, Esoteric, Spartan-1029, Chris, Orion, and Shane, the crush of sub-monitors, Legion, Ryan, Lebrat, Spartan-0137, Element 0, J3, Cult, Evermore's, Personal Devil, Scion Esports, Phantasma, Ashton, and 191 Shaken Lightbulb, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my most loyal of Enforcers, and every single one of the awesome people supporting the channel over on Patreon. My Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members, Spartan-137, again, Maury, Jimbo, and Balaz, and all other YouTube members keeping my installation functional on that glorious vacuum energy. I cannot thank you all enough. Shout out to John because... And if you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting the channel on one of the support links in the description to net yourself some tasty merch and help keep the channel going. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.